Well, welcome on back to the Aware AI Brief. This is our monthly series that looks to address real life AI governance questions, comments, feedback, concerns, what have you. And appreciate all of you that have sent in questions and comments and continue to do so. If you have a question as it relates to AI governance, this is the podcast series where we attempt to try to answer those questions or at least provide some discussion with those questions or those topics. As always, I'm joined by Walter Haydock of StackAware. Walter, how are you doing today?
Cameron, I'm doing well. Good to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you as well. We're this is the week after my oldest, who's 5, gets out of school. So this has they're trying their best to initiate summer vibes. And I said, if you've ever
Yes.
wanted to find some non-deterministic systems, just have a 5-year old. That's that's a system all in and of all of itself. But not talking about human governance, aka parenting here. We're talking about AI governance and the questions that were presented. So, without
Well,
further
I'll
ado,
share.
yeah,
I'll
go.
share. I'll share a story with another non-deterministic
Yeah,
being. So I do also have a toddler, so I can empathize with that. But the other day, my wife, we wake up relatively early, and because the sun rises pretty early in northern New Hampshire in the summer, so it's like 4 a.m. where we're
it's
starting to
there.
rise, and we looked outside, and or she looked outside, and there was a black bear out there, and yeah, someone had left some trash in a place
Oh
where they
my.
shouldn't have, and we had a visitor, and then again this morning she said, "Well, I wonder if we have a black." Yeah, we do have a black bear in our driveway again. So yeah,
Oh
we had
my
another one, and I tried to
goodness.
shoo him away. I tried to shoo him
Yeah,
away because like black bears are supposed to be scared of people. They're not. They're not like grizzlies. You know, a
sure.
grizzly. If you do that, you're
Yeah,
you're in
you
trouble.
got
But
toast. Yeah,
and also I was like, I had my door that I could close if I needed to run
yeah,
away. But he did not. He did not want to go away. Only my dog barking made him run away, which was a little bit concerning. He should
yeah.
not be that comfortable around humans,
Right,
but
right.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
we
So
shall
my I
see.
guess my point is, let's get into the easier things to handle,
Yeah,
which
yeah, the easier
which
things, the
is
things that don't have
easier. Yeah,
claws. Yeah,
yeah. Right.
yeah,
Right. But jumping into our AI governance questions here, and as I mentioned, keep them coming. Greatly appreciate people that have weighed in or suggested some different topics as well. So the first one to look at here: how are or should maybe organizations handle AI enhanced phishing threats?
phishing in general is a massive threat to organizations, and frankly, I am surprised at the degree to which phishing campaigns are not using AI to check spelling, grammar, be tailored to individuals. I think the frontier model providers have some decent safeguards in place where they can identify behavior that reflects someone trying to craft a phishing email, so they may be able to block that. But you would think with things like DeepSeek open source models that people would be ginning up thousands of phishing emails that are tailored to each individual target and then letting them loose on the world. So frankly, I'm a little surprised at how not good AI powered phishing has been. With that said, I think the future is going to be dark and dangerous because of those exact reasons that I mentioned. The people who right now are not impacted by phishing because they don't fall for scams, they just understand what to look for. They know that if they're misspellings or kind of strange characters or things like that, they know that they're dealing with a scam. Increasingly, we're going to see those hyper personalized phishing campaigns that can trick people who would otherwise know not to respond to a given email. I mean, I get relatively well-crafted phishing attempts,
Yeah,
on a pretty
same.
regular basis that are pretty enticing to a business owner. Like, payment for your invoice has been paused. You need to verify your details here. I do get a lot of those, and kind of makes sense to target them at me because that's something I'm concerned about as a business owner. But
Sure.
if you know the signs to look for, you can you can identify them pretty quickly, but I think that's going to be challenging going forward. And I think user education is going to be really important, making people understand what to look for, not just the domain of the sender, because, I've received phishing attempts through otherwise bona fide applications using like sharing functions where they're sharing arbitrary text through a, share this project or type thing. So,
Yeah.
that can get through spam filters. So I wouldn't rely on the sending domain. I think critical thinking is going to be even more important in an AI powered future, because the fake is going to be much harder to tell from the real. And when it comes to phishing, the consequences of not knowing the difference is going to be really, really severe.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think we talk a lot about, processes or structures too, like, as far as having those outlined well. One of the things for emails or invoicing type of questions via email is that how you typically communicate, for these types of inquiries or question marks. So some of the processes part of it too is key. I'm right there with you. I think I'm always a little torn too because AI enters in the need for critical thinking, but if that's not necessarily like more so, but that's not necessarily a bad thing for us all to develop as a society, as organizations. So, but definitely a necessity with the development and increase in the ability of these things.
On a broader cybersecurity note, I put out a LinkedIn post a couple weeks ago focused mainly on how, unfortunately, confidentiality of information has been something that you can't rely on as much as you used to. So,
Hmm.
for example, your social security number, your address, your cell phone number. While it makes sense to apply controls to restrict access to these types of things, on a personal level, I think it makes sense to assume breach, meaning that you should be prepared for what happens after your personally identifiable information gets leaked or gets hacked. I'm not saying that's good. I'm not saying that's acceptable. I'm just saying that's reality. So, for
Sure.
example, with the invoice thing, for my business bank account, I have a feature that lets me allow list recipients. So if someone's trying to come in and do a pull request on my account through ACH, I get a prompt that says, hey, you're getting this request. Unless you approve it within 1 day, it's going to be denied. And then you can set up an allow list of vendors like, Google, obviously for Google Workspace. I allow list them, my insurance company, stuff
Sure.
like that. But I think that's one type of feature that folks should look at is, you know, being prepared for someone having your confidential information and having controls in place that will block them from doing damage even if they do.
Yeah. Yeah. And to your point, that's to anticipate the reality, right? The anticipate that being a reality. Very, very good, um, helpful tips there as well. The second question that we got in was why do existing AI risk decisions, controls, frameworks so often fail at the activation layer? And how can a procedural safeguards approach close that gap between decision and outcome? Maybe kind of evaluating where that breakdown occurs, I think is the gist of the question.
A huge problem in cybersecurity in general and AI risk management in particular is the fact that policies and procedures get written in Word documents and often in very flowery and, in my opinion, unnecessary language where it's difficult to consume, it's stale, it gets out of date over time. And then you have your employees that are forced to, acknowledge these things, which they scroll through and click through as fast as they can. And then it's very easy to have compliance drift from those policies and procedures when they're presented in that form. I think the correct way of doing it is having your policies and procedures written in the form of code, having those take the form of safeguards that are applied to your applications, that are configuration files, that are, you know, vulnerability management scripts, that are asset inventory scripts. These types of things, if you automate them instead of relying on someone reading a policy and then maybe understanding what the policy says, you can ensure that there's less of a gap between the policy and the reality addressing some of those concerns.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. And I think you're right. Like a lot of these things are just kind of on a static Word doc or some form of static presentation, as it were. And so bridging that gap is going to be necessary. If you don't find a way to do that, you will just wind up having things fall through the cracks, fall through the gaps. But yeah. The next question we got in was, what should be the bare minimum or starting point for AI transparency?
The level of transparency that's appropriate will depend on the organization. StackAware, for example, from the beginning, we've been very transparent in how we use AI, what we're doing, the models we're using. We post everything on a publicly available software bill of materials. We let our customers subscribe to updates so they get email notifications anytime there's a change. And that's how we've been operating since day one. Now, for organizations that may not have grown up that way, that might not even have been digitally native, you can't flip a switch and go to that immediately because, first of all, it would just be difficult to do from an operational perspective, but also
Yeah.
you would immediately open up the floodgates in terms of questions from stakeholders, from folks like that.
Hmm.
So my recommendation would be to develop a roadmap for transparency that would start small, maybe at the legally required minimum. For example, if you're subject to GDPR, you may need to disclose your subprocessors, which could include AI subprocessors. And then over time, get more and more transparent about what you're doing. So getting down to the individual model level, explaining, which versions you're using, what your change control procedures are. If you're fine tuning or training models on your own, providing an inventory to the public or to customers of those proprietary models that you're training, because that allows them to make a more informed decision. I think what a bad approach is piecemeal writing blog posts about certain AI projects and then letting people like you and me, frankly, at Stackaware, piece together the parts of how the company is using AI. And,
Right.
we have to come up with our own assessments because, it's possible that those outside evaluators aren't necessarily getting the full picture, but also you're creating a potential delta between what you are revealing and what you want to reveal,
Mhm.
which would be bad based on the reasons that I explained earlier, and that you can't go from 0 to 60 in terms of full transparency right away. You should do it evenly and in a methodical way over time.
Sure. Yeah, kind of build that out. Unless to your point, it's something that you have the ability or the privilege of kind of building in from the get-go. But
Well,
that's
yeah,
it's
if you
probably
can.
it's probably just not the case or not really doable for most organizations.
Yeah, I mean, if you can start from a completely transparent perspective, then I think that makes sense.
Yeah.
And you will set expectations of transparency, and it's kind of hard to go back from that. But I think it's helpful. It's healthy for an organization. It builds trust with customers if you're transparent from the start. And if you're not where you want to be, then build a roadmap to get there.
Yeah. Yeah. Next question was, how do you scope out your customer AI management system? Is it only limited to the model? I'm assuming meaning the AI model being used, but maybe more of the first part of that question, like how do you go about scoping out your customer AI management system?
ISO 42001 is the blueprint for an AI management system, and that can cover a wide range of things. So it really depends on what the customer is trying to accomplish with their AI management system and ISO 42001 certification. Oftentimes, I find that customers will choose their AI powered products for the initial scope of the certification and the management system, while at the same time expanding the requirements to the entire organization so that they have an even and consistent way of managing risk. But they're not looking for an external audit of the entire organization. They're not including HR, marketing, things like that. They're just
Sure.
including their core revenue generating products. That is one approach. Now, some companies might consider doing that enterprise-wide approach from the beginning and including that within the full scope. I think there are advantages to that, but there are also some drawbacks in terms of cost, time, just ability to maintain that compliance across the entire organization if folks have different priorities. So it really depends on what the business objectives of the organization are. And the most common approach is scoping the AI management system to just cover that customer's AI powered products. And that can extend to third party models or service providers that are powering it. Or if they're building proprietary ones, it can cover those as well.
Yeah, yeah, and what are most likely the business needs or focal points? It's the revenue generating aspects of the business, right? So that makes all the sense in the world. And then we have a question: how do you avoid accountability gaps? I know you talked a little bit about the framework gaps, or maybe from risk decision to actual implementation or activation, but the accountability specifically, how do you avoid, or how could an organization try to avoid any sort of accountability gaps as it relates to AI, governance, AI safety, things like that?
There are two easy ways to minimize accountability gaps in your governance program. First of all, you can ensure that all your policies and procedures use the active voice. And by that, I mean you have a subject and a verb saying, this person shall do that. Johnny must update the inventory. Sally must patch the vulnerabilities. When you say things like vulnerabilities must be patched or inventories must be updated, it begs the immediate question of who is doing that action. And now you don't
Right.
necessarily need to assign that to an individual person. I would recommend assigning it to a specific role. So the chief
Yeah.
technology officer shall, the chief information security officer must. Those are the right ways to assign accountability when it comes to AI governance. And then a second thing to do is to look at your policies and procedures and determine if you can write a script to find out whether you're in compliance or not. If the policy is the CEO will take the best efforts to maintain security throughout the company, there's no way to falsify that. There's no real way to
Right.
say we didn't hit our objective. Now,
Right.
if you say our, our scaled vulnerability remediation timeline based on exploit prediction scoring system rating of these issues is, XYZ days, or, we will mitigate risks above our appetite within, Y hours, minutes, quarters, what have you. That's something that you can look at and say, yes, we hit it, or no, we didn't hit it. And, obviously you're going to need to act accordingly and make sure that your objectives are written in a reasonable way. But if you have really squishy objectives or key performance indicators, then you are going to have those accountability gaps.
Yeah. Yeah, as you were talking, I was thinking about how people will reference, when you're filling out a resume or something like that, like attach some form of metric or number to it, because instead of just saying like, "Oh, I closed sales at this company," it's like, how do you, being able to quantify it is key to be able to show what was actually done, and I think for accountability, to your point, that's those KPIs or whatever metrics are being included in it give you an ability to judge it against something instead of kind of that squishy type of wording as you had mentioned. All right, so I brought in last time my sports talk media um, reference of overhyped, underhyped, properly hyped, and for my own amusement, I brought it back again for this week, and just some different kind of concepts or topics, I guess, and get your take on them, or maybe even some explanations if it's definition based. So the first one, overhyped, underhyped, properly hyped, chain of thought prompting.
Probably appropriately hyped. It depends exactly what you mean here. When I think of chain of thought, that's to me, that means you can see the agent or the model telling you how it's chaining together its ideas.
Yeah,
Or conversely, you could say you could tell it to walk through step by step, and force it into that mode. And I think that's useful. Also, from a logging and monitoring perspective, you may want to consider capturing those intermediate outputs from the model if it's doing something consequential, to be able to trace back and figure out why it did a certain thing. I have found that some of the intermediate chain of thought outputs are frankly annoying and dumb in many cases,
yeah,
like, using exclamation points when talking it to itself from a
mm-hmm.
model is kind of silly. And I wonder if that's more of a marketing or UX thing than it is
Yeah,
a technical performance improvement thing. But at the same time, I think the concept is useful, and I would say from a compliance perspective, it might make sense to capture some of those along the way so that you can rebuild the line of reasoning of a given model.
yeah. Yeah, I had I think I sent a text to one of my friends too, just a screenshot of something I was working on where it was showing that, and according to this, that LLM said, "Huh," in, its deliberation. So I was like, I'm pretty sure this didn't actually occur. That this is something they threw in there just because they knew somebody was going to be reading it. But yeah, good points on that. The next one, overhyped, underhyped, properly hyped, is RAG, or retrieval augmented generation.
Retrieval augmented generation is critical for a lot of different business processes. Basically, what it does is it takes a model that is pre trained and then exposes it to a data set and allows the model to retrieve information from that data set, grounding the response in the underlying information. And I think it's really important. It's critical for a lot of enterprise use cases. For example, customer support. When you are interacting with someone, you will want to be able to pull the history of interactions with that person and use that as a basis for making recommendations, deciding whether to escalate. Some key things to consider are whether you have a neutral security policy or not, especially with RAG. The most common security vulnerability I see when doing penetration tests and red teaming exercises for companies is a tainted trust boundary, where they'll use a service account to pull the information from the database and then expose it to a model where the user doesn't necessarily have the permissions to see all of the underlying data, but the model will actually get access to more information than it should and can reproduce it to the user. So that's a very
Mm,
common vulnerability that I see, that I talk about a lot, but I just keep seeing it all the time in penetration testing engagements. So, you know, happy to sniff those out for you if you
mm,
want stack aware too, but you know it's probably cheaper to just fix them up front and take care of it beforehand. So that's my take on RAG, specifically from a security perspective.
yeah, yeah. Okay, I got just a couple more on these, and then we'll close out. But I'm going to switch the order here a little bit. We'll do human-centered AI, and I think it's a buzzword I've started to see more and more. Maybe it's just my algorithm personally, but does it represent anything tangible? Merely aspirational marketing, overhyped, underhyped, properly hyped?
I'm going to say overhyped, considering I have seen the phrase, but I don't actually know what it means.
Yeah,
I've heard of human centered design, I guess, from IDEO and firms like that.
Yeah.
I don't 100% know what it means, and I think there's something to be said about the implications of AI use for humanity, and what are we doing here, and even if you don't take a doomer perspective of Eliezer Yudkowsky or someone like that who thinks that AI is going to annihilate the world, there's still going to be impacts from a societal,
Yeah.
from a labor displacement, from an environmental perspective. So I definitely don't scoff at taking those into account. Actually,
Hmm.
ISO 42001 demands that you take those into
It
account.
does.
So
Yeah.
obviously not scoffing at that, but I think it's really important to be clear about what you mean when you use a phrase like that, and not saying that you aren't. You are like me, and not being clear about exactly
Yeah.
what it does mean. But a lot of companies, I kind of have mocked a couple unnamed companies for saying, here are AI principles. One, transparency. We are transparent. Two,
Yeah.
privacy. We are private. Three, niceness. We are nice.
Yeah.
And
Fairness. Yeah. We are
yeah,
fair. Yeah.
fairness. We are
Yeah.
fair. So I don't really think that adds a lot of value if
Hmm.
you kind of put this motherhood and apple pie spin on everything to do with AI and call it your responsible AI principles. And yeah, and I find this, the most jarring, or most kind of annoying to me, is when people say, "Oh yeah, we must eliminate bias or not have
Mm.
bias in our AI systems." To which I would say, "Okay, well then just delete the model. That's the only way that you're going
Right.
to that's the
Right.
only way that you're going to do it, because AI systems, they make predictions using bias. That is how they operate. It is
Hmm.
inherent to the AI model. Now, you could say, yes, we want to avoid unlawful bias, certainly, and there are some regulations that define what that could be. Definitely want to avoid that, because you could be penalized for it and it's, unethical. You
Hmm.
could also say we want to avoid brand damaging bias, which may not be illegal, but might exceed our reputation risk appetite, which is perfectly acceptable to say. And that appetite might vary by firms. A startup that's more edgy might have a greater risk appetite for reputation, impacting outputs than, Berkshire Hathaway or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, you got to take it all into account.
And it reminds me a little bit of something you had mentioned previous on the accountability question that had been raised, and that's like if you're just saying like, bias is bad, if you're not defining or if you're not further attaching what you're proposing to something tangible, like it loses its strength off the bat. And my question for human centered AI, and I get kind of some of the idea behind it, or that phraseology, but my question was always like, who else were we governing this for? Like, as a society, we're kind of in the human boat of how we handle this. And the other thing I thought of was you had talked previously. I don't remember on this podcast series or maybe another about I think it's like a 2 by 2 grid of like sounds
Hmm.
dumb is
Hmm.
smart, and I thought this
Hmm.
one this one might kind of lean towards, on that axis. It might lean towards the sounds smart is dumb category, just because it's so ambiguous. The last one I had for this.
That's the most deadly quadrant, is
It is.
sound
Yeah,
smart
it
is dumb.
absolutely is. It absolutely is. I've referenced that mentally, that little grid, many times in evaluation of the things I am saying or the things I am proposing. I'm like, is this a
Okay.
sound smart is dumb thing? Like, I gotta check myself a little bit.
You
Um,
don't want to outsmart yourself, or try
no,
to. I do
no,
that all the time, and sometimes I realize after spending an hour trying to do something, I just should have just not done it to begin with.
right, right. Yeah, the best solution was not
Hmm.
doing this. The last one, may be a little spicy. I don't know. I think we're kind of all just waiting to see how it shakes out. But overhyped, underhyped, properly hyped, the EU AI Act.
Massively overhyped, and I have been actively mocking the European Union from a regulatory credibility perspective for years at this point, for years, because they were very vocal all up until, call it November of 2025, saying, not one step back. We are not amending the deadline. We
Yeah.
are not changing anything. And here we are 2 months, a little more than 2 months before the high risk obligations come online.
Yeah.
And we don't have a finalized agreement to change those high risk deadlines. We have the political agreement, excuse me, but we don't have finalized text on the
Hmm.
updated, hard requirements. And, frankly, I think it's kind of embarrassing that the EU just keeps missing its own deadlines. And I've made this criticism of American legislators too. So it's not me hating on Europe uh, specifically or exceptionally, but if legislators can't come up with clear definitions or they can't come up with deadlines that they themselves can hit, then they should probably rethink legislating about that topic to begin with.
Yeah. Yeah, and in this category, I've thought of Colorado's SB 205 and like some of the other legislation we've seen where people were kind of first, I don't know if first to market's the right term, but at least first like proposing these different acts and these different regulations, and we've seen the cracks happen and existed that one way or the other, with Colorado just basically scrapping it for more or less. Um, and then the EUAI Act, just the delays and the and kind of seemingly lack of that follow through, or just lack of that momentum continuing. So I wanted to get your take on it. I had an inkling as far as where you would rate this for overhyped, underhyped, properly hyped, but yeah, looking to see. I love your point about if we're going to entrust this is being entrusted to legislators, and so they do bear that burden of providing something that is worthwhile, right? Like taking the time necessary to do it well, rather than maybe trying to run out too far ahead of it if it's not actually going to have the momentum to see it come to be. So, well, I appreciate it, Walter. Appreciate all. That one was my question for those of you that might be keeping score at home. Just wanted to see if I'd get a little bit of a rise out of you. But thank you all for sending in questions or commenting on different posts, different videos. You can, if you have a question, you can comment on this video. You can comment on posts from Walter or myself on LinkedIn. DM us questions as well. Really anywhere that you would choose to get a hold of us. Anything that relates to AI governance, a topic, can be a question or a comment, or just something that you might have rattling around in your brain that you want to see discussed. Maybe not even answered, but just discussed. One of the things I love about these types of open forums, so to speak, is you might have a question that somebody else has, and so by asking it or by presenting it, you're helping others, you're helping us, and kind of working through AI governance hurdles together. So thank you all for listening and sending questions. Walter, thank you as well, and we'll see you all next month on the next Aware AI Brief.
Thanks, Cameron.